Trump's tariffs spark textile shockwaves.
China reroutes exports, U.S. jobs at risk.
Global trade war hits American workers.
EU benefits, America pays the price.
Trump's tariffs were meant to punish China, a bold strike designed to protect U.S. workers and force Beijing to bend. But instead of crushing China, they've unleashed a shockwave, tearing through the global economy. China didn't retreat, it adapted, fast. Billions in textile exports are now flooding into Europe, securing new markets and fresh profits for Beijing. Europe is cashing in, building leverage. And America is left cornered. U.S. mills are squeezed, costs are climbing, and workers are staring down the edge of mass layoffs. By 2026, experts warn this policy could ignite a full-blown U.S. jobs crisis, one powerful enough to hollow out entire communities. Let's start with the facts. In 2018, during Trump's first term, the U.S. launched a wave of tariffs against Chinese goods. Textiles and apparel were hit with duties of up to 25%. The message was simple: force supply chains back to the United States. But in practice, the global market didn't sit still. China remains the world's largest textile exporter. In 2023, it shipped over $300 billion in textiles and apparel worldwide. The U.S. was once a key buyer. But when tariffs made Chinese products more expensive in America, Beijing pivoted. It rerouted exports, and Europe became the new prize. Look at the numbers. In 2023, the European Union imported nearly 40 billion euros worth of textiles from China, a jump of more than 20% in 5 years. China now supplies nearly 1/3 of all apparel imports into Europe. In contrast, U.S. textile imports from China plunged.
At first glance, that might sound like a win for Washington. Fewer Chinese goods entering the United States. But here's the hidden truth. America didn't rebuild its textile industry to fill the gap. Instead, imports shifted to places like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Cambodia. Jobs did not return to U.S. soil. In fact, between 2018 and 2023, the number of U.S. textile jobs stagnated around 340,000, far below the millions that existed decades earlier. And this is where the story turns darker. Because while China lost market share in the United States, it gained even more in Europe. Chinese textile giants, backed by state subsidies and cheaper energy, outcompeted European mills. Local European producers are now being squeezed, warning of shutdowns. That means Europe will be even more dependent on Beijing in the years to come. And as Europe deepens its reliance, America loses leverage. But what does this mean for the average American family? Let's connect the dots. U.S. tariffs raise the cost of imported goods. When retailers buy from alternative suppliers in Southeast Asia instead of China, the prices don't magically stay low. They rise. American consumers feel it every time they shop for clothing, shoes, or household fabrics. Inflation in apparel prices has been creeping upward, with some categories spiking 5 to 7% in the past 2 years alone. That's just the beginning. Because China's rerouting strategy is not just about keeping exports flowing, it's about positioning itself in a way that locks the U.S. out of future trade gains. By pivoting to Europe, Beijing builds stronger ties with Brussels, while Washington isolates itself. Imagine this. Europe gets cheaper supply, stable flow, and political goodwill. America gets higher prices, weaker supply chains, and vanishing jobs.
This is not a theory, it's already visible in the data. For example, in 2024, U.S. imports of textiles from Vietnam grew nearly 15%, while imports from China declined sharply. But here's the catch. Many of those Vietnamese exports are made with Chinese fabric. China is funneling raw material into Southeast Asia, laundering its exports through third countries, and still capturing the value chain. The tariffs don't stop China, they just force it to adapt. And that adaptation is costing Americans more. Now let's talk jobs. The U.S. textile industry once employed over 2.4 million workers in the 1970s. Today, it's less than 15% of that. The hope under Trump's tariff plan was that higher import costs would push retailers to source from American factories. But the economics never lined up. Labor costs in the U.S. are simply too high compared to Asia. Automation fills some gaps, but it doesn't create mass employment. So instead of factories reopening in North or South Carolina, the industry shifted sourcing to cheaper nations, not home. The consequence? Tariffs may raise revenue for Washington, but they don't create jobs. Instead, they redistribute trade flows in ways that disadvantage U.S. workers and consumers. And by 2026, if trends continue, economists warn that tens of thousands of U.S. jobs in related industries, retail, logistics, and manufacturing support, could vanish. Let's make that tangible. Think of an American family shopping at Walmart or Target. Clothes that used to cost $20 now cost $25 or $30. Shoes that were $60 jump to $75. Multiply that across every household, and you get billions drained from consumer wallets. Inflation that feels invisible at first, but grinds down living standards over time.
Meanwhile, European consumers may see the opposite. They gain access to cheaper Chinese supply. Their mills may suffer, yes, but their retailers and shoppers pay less. So, as American households struggle with higher prices, Europeans could enjoy bargains. It's a cruel twist. Tariffs meant to punish China could end up punishing America instead. Let's zoom out further. China is not just rerouting for survival, it's playing a long game. By deepening ties with Europe, Beijing undermines the united Western front that Washington desperately wants. If Brussels relies on Beijing for billions in textiles, will Europe support harsher sanctions or stricter tariffs in the future? Probably not. Dependency builds hesitation. So, Trump's tariffs, instead of isolating China, may have unintentionally driven Europe closer to it. And when America needs Europe's backing, whether on sanctions, trade negotiations, or strategic alignment, it may find Brussels less willing to comply. This is where the stakes rise even higher. Because this isn't just about textiles, it's about precedent. If China can reroute textiles successfully, what stops it from rerouting electronics, machinery, or green tech products? Nothing. In fact, it's already happening. And textiles are just the first warning shot. By the time America realizes it, the US could be facing a hollowed-out trade position, soaring consumer prices, and a fractured alliance with Europe. And by 2026, that convergence could erupt into a jobs crisis powerful enough to devastate working-class families across the United States. And the shocking part? This was entirely predictable.
We've seen how Trump's tariffs pushed China's textile exports into Europe. We've seen how US jobs failed to return and how American consumers are now paying more. But this isn't just a trade story, it's a power story, a geopolitical rebalancing, and it's accelerating faster than most Americans realize. Because by 2026, the collision of economics and politics could ignite something far larger than a jobs crisis. Look at Europe. Already, more than 30% of EU apparel imports come from China. Local mills in Italy, France, and Germany are warning of shutdowns as they can't compete with Beijing's scale and subsidies. But European retailers are thrilled. They get lower costs and wider supply. This creates a dangerous dependency. If China controls Europe's textile flow, it gains leverage not just economically, but politically. Imagine Brussels trying to impose sanctions on Beijing in a future crisis, but China threatens to cut off supply to Zara, H&M, or Primark. How bold would Europe really be? Now think about America. Washington needs Europe as a partner in trade wars, in sanctions, in global strategy. But by rerouting textiles, China is making Europe more reluctant to follow US pressure. That means when Washington calls for a united front, Brussels may hesitate. This is how a tariff on t-shirts and jeans becomes a wedge in global alliances. Let's break down Beijing's playbook. First, reroute exports to Europe. Second, funnel raw materials through Southeast Asia to avoid direct tariff walls. Third, secure long-term contracts that lock in European dependency.
By 2025, many Chinese textile firms are signing deals with European retailers, guaranteeing stable supply for years. That means even if US policy shifts, Europe will already be tied into Beijing's system. And America? America will find itself cut out of the deal. But it's not just textiles. China is applying the same strategy in green technology, semiconductors, and machinery. If the US tries to block solar panels, China redirects them to Europe. If the US targets electric vehicles, China offers Europe cheap EVs with state subsidies. The pattern is clear: isolation for Washington, opportunity for Beijing. And the longer this continues, the more global supply chains bend away from America. So what happens by 2026? Economists see three scenarios. Scenario 1, the squeeze tightens. Tariffs remain in place. China continues rerouting. American consumers keep paying more. Inflation in apparel prices could rise another 10 to 15% by 2026. Families spend hundreds more each year on clothing, eating into already strained budgets. Meanwhile, U.S. textile jobs remain stagnant or even decline as retailers avoid American factories. Scenario 2, the collapse. If Southeast Asia's supply chains buckle, say from climate shocks or regional instability, U.S. retailers may face shortages. Prices could spike dramatically. Picture school uniforms doubling in cost. Picture a retail industry forced to cut jobs because fewer consumers can afford rising prices. This is the nightmare scenario. Not only do American families pay more, but U.S. workers in retail and logistics lose jobs in the tens of thousands. Scenario 3, policy reversal. Washington realizes the backfire and scales down tariffs. But by then, Europe's dependency on China may be locked in. Even if America reopens trade, it may not get its position back. Instead, Europe benefits, China consolidates, and America remains weakened.
Let's humanize this. In North Carolina, once the heart of U.S. textiles, factories employed hundreds of thousands. Today, many of those towns have hollowed out. A tariff wall was supposed to bring jobs back, but instead, it's likely to accelerate their decline. Think about a family in Greensboro. Dad works in logistics, moving clothing shipments from ports. Mom works retail. Their kids need school clothes. If tariffs drive up prices and imports reroute elsewhere, Dad's hours get cut, Mom's store reduces staff, and the kids' clothes cost more. That's not protection, that's punishment. Multiply that story across thousands of families, and you see the scale of what economists mean by a jobs crisis. It's not just factory workers, it's the ecosystem, transport, warehousing, retail, even marketing, that depends on stable and affordable trade. By 2026, that ecosystem could be collapsing. Here's the contradiction. Tariffs were supposed to protect U.S. workers. Instead, they're protecting nobody. Not the workers, not the consumers, not the retailers. The only clear winner so far? China. Beijing keeps exports flowing, builds new alliances, and strengthens its grip on Europe. Washington, meanwhile, faces rising costs, fractured alliances, and restless workers. This is why analysts call tariffs a boomerang policy. They fly out with force, but they come back to hit the hand that threw them. So what can be done? Experts argue America needs more than tariffs. It needs industrial policy. That means investing directly in U.S. factories, supporting innovation, and building competitive supply chains at home. Without that, tariffs are just walls without a fortress behind them. Another option? Strengthen partnerships with allies beyond Europe, Japan, South Korea, even India, to offset China's dominance. But that requires diplomatic capital, and tariffs often erode goodwill.
There's also the nuclear option, expand tariffs even further, tightening the squeeze. But history shows escalation only fuels retaliation. China could strike back by restricting rare earth exports or electronics components, triggering crises far beyond textiles. So the path forward is murky, and the clock is ticking. By 2026, America could be standing at a crossroads. One path leads to a controlled reset, with smarter policies and global alliances. The other? A downward spiral of higher prices, lost jobs, and broken trust in Washington's promises. Trump's tariffs were meant to punish China. Instead, they may have punished America itself. The jobs crisis is not coming from some distant future. It's being written into policy right now. And if the warnings are ignored, the collapse may arrive sooner than anyone expects. In the end, tariffs are not just taxes on trade. They are decisions that ripple through every store, every factory, every household. And when those decisions backfire, it is ordinary Americans, not politicians, not corporations, who pay the steepest price.